Right. Oh, sorry, before I get started, is it Johann Hari or Harry?
Said it right first time. I
Har
once waited for 6 hours with a broken arm in casualty because they were calling for Johann Hari to come forward.
Right, okay. Okay, good. Okay, good afternoon, Kanye West fans and Kanye Kardashian fans. My name's Danny. This is My Own Worst Enemy mental health podcast. Okay, firstly, just a quick apology for being a few days late with this episode. I've been ill again. Yeah. So far this year, I've had two stomach bugs. I've had the flu. I've had a chest infection, and then just this past week, I don't know what it was, something like strep throat or something. Put it this way: every time I swallowed, right, it felt like someone was fisting my esophagus wearing a boxing glove covered in glass. So that's been fun. What else? Oh, my car, right? Remember I bought a new car? Well, not a new car, like a new used car, whatever. Well, two things, right? Firstly, I spent 3 grand on the thing, right? I only wanted to spend 500, right? Everyone's mithering me, pressuring me, like, oh, you need to spend a bit more if you want to get something reliable or whatever. Um, I haven't got thousands of pounds, right? This is on a credit card, so it's not my money, someone else's money. It's easy to spend someone else's money. Anyway, I cave in because everyone starts using like the kids as leverage. Oh, you got to keep the kids safe. You buy something cheap, it's not safe for the kids or whatever. So cave in, wipe out the credit card, one fell swoop, right? I'm thinking, well, at least for this price, there shouldn't be anything wrong with it. Wrong. There's already something wrong with the engine, right? And because I wiped out the credit card on it, buying the bleeding thing in the first place, I can't afford to get it fixed. I got no extra money. And what's worse is, right, just discovered this recently, because we decided to spend 6 times more than I wanted to on it, I thought, right, if I'm going to spend this much, I want something. I want something nice. I want something like as posh as possible for the money. So we bought a Jag, right, an S-type Jag, all leather, all the bells and whistles, or what have you, or just more shit to go wrong with it. In other words. Anyway, right, my dad's disabled. Yeah, he's got muscular dystrophy, so he can't get about too great on his pins and that, and he's getting worse with it. That's just sort of like the nature of the disease. And so I was thinking it's probably time for him to like get a wheelchair, an electric one, so he can get about a bit more safely in. Anyway, so someone's selling one on Facebook, right? 500 nicker they want for it. I'm a skinflint, you already know. So I'll send him a message, say I'll give you 300 quid for it. I'm expecting him to negotiate, come back at 400 quid, because I'd be happy with that. But he doesn't. He just says, right, fine, whatever, come and get it. Anyway, so it's in Wales, North Wales. I drive all the way to Wales, right? Hour and a half drive. Turns out the address is on like a council estate. Yeah, I pull up outside, the old bleeding family are there waiting for me. Every single one of them stood there fagging it with a fag in the mouth. Even the baby. Well, not the baby, not literally a baby, but he was 11 at the most. Anyway, and as I said before, right, I'm not having a dig, painting a picture, right? My mum lives on the council estate. Like the council estate that my mum lives on, right? If that was a dartboard, she lives in the bullseye, right? Dead centre. And in fact, where I live round here, this shithole, this isn't much better, right? It's like, I don't know, nice houses, nice gardens, but step through the front door, every single one of them's a wrong un. Like Wisteria Lane in that sense, Desperate Housewives, like it looks nice, but it's full of idiots. Um, like these who live opposite here, this couple, right? They're always kicking the shit out of each other at 3 a.m. every Saturday evening, right? To the blissful, sleep-inducing sounds of Tiesto at 70 billion decibels. Got Enoch Powell here, living next door. Every time I speak to him, it's a Rivers of Blood speech about how the bleeding foreigners are ruining everything. He's the same one who called his wife a C-word a couple of months ago. And then this block of flats over here. That's basically just a storage closet full of extras from the cast of Benidorm, right? So yeah, I'm not being snobby, right? I'm in it. Anyway, you should have seen the faces when I pulled up, right? It's a 3 grand Jag, yeah. A basic Ford Focus, brand new nowadays, costs something like 18 grand. I've purchased it on a credit card, right? It's pissing out engine coolant at the rate of like a £6 bottle every 2 days. Shitty bang bang, right? But because it's a Jag, I realise they're looking at me like, how dare this cheeky bastard, right? Who's obviously not short of a bob or two, driving around in a Jag. How dare he knock us down by 200 quid for this wheelchair? I get out of the car, right? First thing the guy says to me, yeah, not hello, not trust you had a pleasant journey. He says, is that an S-type Jag? So I'm like, a what type? And he's like, an S-type Jag. I'm just like, oh, I haven't got a clue, mate. I've just borrowed it off my uncle for the day just to get this wheelchair on because the boot's not big enough in my car. Telling lies. Anyway, then there's like an awkward atmosphere then through like the whole purchase. He's thinking, you know, you've obviously like come from a rich family or something, borrowing this posh car off your uncle. And he's at it. He's on it. He's. Oh, you're getting a bargain here, mate. 300 quid cost us over a grand. This did brand new. You're getting a bargain. Look at it. It's in mint condition. You're getting a bargain here. I'm thinking, look, you didn't want to go down to 300 quid. You shouldn't have agreed to it, right? I was happy with 400. More fool you for not haggling back. So I'm thinking this is brilliant, this, right? Not only have I bought an overpriced shitter that's already hemorrhaging money, but it's an overpriced shitter that's going to make it even harder for me to haggle with people on Facebook Marketplace because it sort of projects the illusion of middle class status that I don't actually possess. You know, so when I turn up to someone's house to pick up my goods, right, I've either got to park round the corner and walk so they don't see the car, which is no good if I'm buying something heavy like a fridge freezer, right? Or I've got to keep on with this lies that I've borrowed it off my imaginary uncle. So yeah, great. Anyway, that's the moaning out of the way. Time for a couple of announcements. So, firstly, the other week I interviewed the paedophile guy, Tom O'Carroll. Well, I did intend to sort of remain objective with that whole thing, keep a sort of hands-off approach, you know, do the interview, fling it out into the ether, and then let you geeks have at it. But then, in the comment section on Tom's blog, where he wrote about the episode, I noticed that like the odd snarky comment started to bleed into the conversation about me. Started with things like, I'm either too brainwashed or too stupid to understand the towering intellectual logic of the pro-paedophile stance. So, yeah, true to form, not being able to resist, I went and stuck my big R in, didn't I? Wound up getting in a big, long, heated debate with about 20 paedophiles about whether or not it's okay to have sexual relations with someone who still dresses in Peppa Pig dungarees. And when we started this debate, there was something like 12 comments, yeah? By the time we finished, there was something like 250, 300. It was insane, right? My inbox starts piling up with all these paedophiles calling me an anti-male feminist because I want to stop them expressing their sexuality with children. And I'm either a liar or a faggot, quote unquote, because I wouldn't admit to being attracted to 11-year-old girls, which is the age that all men consider optimal, apparently, whether they want to openly admit it or not. I'm a Nazi as well, because of my oppressive attitude, of course. No debate with someone more conservative than you is ever complete without accusing them of being a Nazi. So, yeah, that was exhausting, right? And took up way too much of my time and attention. And then just this past week, I've let myself get drawn into a couple of political debates on Twitter. And I sat there thinking, what am I doing? We actually talk about this in the conversation today, like this problem with allowing yourself to get drawn into social media. And I think it's partly a generational thing, partly probably a personality thing. Like social media for me has always been a bit weird. Like I don't get it. Like, I mean, I do get it conceptually. I get why people use it, but I've just never, and I don't enjoy it, and I never really have. But also, I'm very opinionated, especially politically. And because these social media platforms are all born out of Silicon Valley, pretty much every single one of them is just like this liberal hellhole that's full of identity politics and mock outrage and offence seeking. And I keep finding myself being drawn into some of the ridiculous discussions that go on there and just pissing my life away thumbing through people's timelines. Anyway, so I saw my ass the other day and just deleted all my social media history. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Not completely, like I've left my pages up, the pages are still there. And I'm still going to like engage in shameless self-promotion, like whenever an episode comes out for this podcast or whatever, I'm going to announce it. But that's it, I'm not going to get involved in any sort of interactions anymore. I'm not even gonna like check my notifications. That I've deleted all the apps off my phone and everything. So the only reason that I mention that is there are some people, some listeners who tend to reach out to me via social media, but that's not going to be an option anymore. From now on, it's just email. It's not that I don't want to hear from people. I love hearing from you guys, but it's just I'd rather it be in one single place where I can just sort of read and reply to things without without any other distractions, like fucking hashtags and what's trending or whatever, all that bollocks basically. So from now on, if you guys want to contact me, you've either got to go to the contact page on the website, myOwnWorstEnemy.org/contact. I think it's /contact. Just go to the website, there's a contact page there. Or you can email me directly, which is just danny@myOwnWorstEnemy.org. Okay, so that's that. The second announcement is that this right now is going to be the last introduction of its kind for the podcast. Now, I know some of you guys enjoy hearing me pissing and moaning about my life before every episode. I told you I had one cheeky bastard the other week say that was the best thing about the podcast, and I do kind of I enjoy doing it. It's like therapy for me, I guess, having a little moan once a week. But the thing is, I know it's only 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes, these intros usually, but it takes quite a lot of time to put together. I've got to set up the equipment. I don't have a studio. I'm sort of occupying our bedroom space here, getting in the way. It's a bit cramped and fiddly to put together. Sometimes it takes like a couple of takes to get it right, and then I have to edit it. I've got to sync the video with the sound, which I record separately on this thing here. You can hear me tapping on. And then what else? I've got to download the interview from Google Hangouts. Then I've got to splice the intro and the interview together. I've got to render it, which takes about like 6 or 7 hours or whatever. And then I've got to re-upload it to YouTube, which takes another couple of hours. And it's just a lot of extra hassle for very little, if any, added value. I know it's a bit of fun, me ranting and raving like a 30-something Victor Meldrew or whatever. But I'm thinking, yeah, instead of using what little spare time I can cobble together, expanding the length of the interview episodes, that time could be spent producing additional content. I keep saying I'm gonna do some more stuff for YouTube. I did intend to start that back in January, but the whole demonetization thing that kind of made it less of a priority. But we're finally creeping towards the 1,000 subscriber threshold, which means I'm going to be eligible for monetization again. So I think I want to finally have a crack at actually producing some video content, and also producing more content for the paid subscribers as well. So yeah, it's been fun. It's been good practice, sort of getting used to telling stories and speaking in front of a camera and what have you. But I think it's time to switch things up a little, I think. So on that note, for the last time in this particular format, my guest today is Johann Hari. Johann is a 2-time New York Times best-selling author. His book, Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs, has been translated into 15 languages and is currently being adapted into a major Hollywood film and a non-fiction documentary series. Johann is one of the most viewed TED speakers of all time, with his talk, Everything You Think You Know About Addiction Is Wrong, and the animation based on it, having been viewed more than 20 million times. He is the recipient of multiple awards for his writing, including Cultural Commentator of the Year and Environmental Commentator of the Year at the Comment Awards, Gay Journalist of the Year at the Stonewall Awards. He got the Martha Gellhorn Prize for political writing and was twice named the National Newspaper Journalist of the Year by Amnesty International. And here's me winning Twat of the Week award from the paedophile community. His latest book, and the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, is Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. So I contacted Johann back in early February to ask him to come on the podcast, and he was like, yeah, let's get something arranged. But because his book was blowing up around about that time, it was difficult for us to pin a date down. And then a couple of weeks later, he went on the Joe Rogan podcast, which gets something ridiculous like 30 million downloads a month. And at that point, I was just like, I've got no chance now. It's like, you go on Joe Rogan, and then there's literally no point, at least from a marketing perspective, to come on my piddly little podcast. However, Johann was indeed a man of his word. We carried on trying to pin a date down, and finally got something arranged with his agent. But then a bit of miscommunication occurred for whatever reason. I think it's because I emailed them saying I'm free anytime, and then they sent me a date, and then I think I just took that as being a booking without actually confirming it. So my fault really. Anyway, so I email Johann 5 minutes before I think we're due to go online. I'm like, okay, ready in five. Emails back like, shit, I didn't know anything about this. And I always try and book my guest for like 90 minutes, but unbeknownst to me, he's preparing to fly out to Australia. I think to start research on his new book or something. And he's like, well, I can jump online, but I can only give you to like 7 o'clock, which I think by the time we actually got set up and got on Google Hangouts together, uh, we had something like 35 minutes. And it's like, oh, well, it is what it is. I've sort of got to make the best of it. I mean, you've heard the stats, yeah? 2 times New York Times bestseller, multiple awards, 20 million downloads, Joe Rogan podcast. It's very clear who's doing who a favour in this scenario. So, I'll take whatever I can get. If it's 5 minutes, I'll take 5 minutes. Anyway, so we did the 35 minutes. I'm getting ready to wrap up, and then he's like, "Oh, it's okay. I can stick around, do another half an hour." So we did another half an hour, and then he stuck around for another 20 minutes on top of that. So we actually wound up doing just about 5 minutes short of 90 minutes after all, which is probably more indicative of Johann's generosity than anything else. But we're going to pretend that he enjoyed the interview so much that he just didn't want it to end. But whatever the reason, I'm glad he did stick around, because the last 20 minutes of this episode, I mean, the entire interview is brilliant. Johann's a fucking rock star, but the last 20 minutes of this are I thought that it's just fucking golden. So, anyway, in today's episode, we discuss Johann's own personal history with depression, why it's sometimes difficult for us to make the connection between our depressed mood and the challenging aspects of our life that may be causing them, how modern junk values can affect our happiness, and the small changes that you can make in your environment to inoculate yourself from their influence. We explore why the chemical imbalance theory of depression is too simplistic, why the effectiveness of chemical antidepressants is overstated, why it's important to reassociate feelings of anxiety and depression with meaning and circumstance, and as a result, why we should expand our definition of antidepressants to include things like gardening, social media sabbaticals, and even purchasing a cow. Seriously. You can follow Johann on Twitter. He's at Johann Hari 101. That's at Johann Hari 101. For more information about the book, Lost Connections, including news and updates and upcoming events, you can go to thelostconnections.com. That's thelostconnections.com. As always, you can find the show notes for this episode at myownworstenemy.org. And finally, if you enjoy this podcast, you want to help support it, you can make a one-time donation for as little as £1, or if you'd like to receive a little something in return, you can subscribe for as little as £2 a month and gain access to exclusive content, including a monthly AMA or Ask Me Anything episode, the next one of which will be coming out over the weekend. And that's pretty much it. So, with all that said, one final time, please enjoy my conversation with the truly brilliant Johann Hari. Okay, Johann Hari, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me. I really do appreciate it.
Oh, thank God. Listening to your accent is making me nostalgic, because my sister lives very near where you are, and my nephew and my niece have your accent, so it's making me not quite homesick, because it's not my home, but yeah, pining to go and see my sister and my nephew and my niece. So
That's it, South Manchester, Stockport born and bred. Okay, so today we are talking about your book and your journey that was documented in Lost Connections. Massive book, been a huge success, caused quite a bit of a stir in the psychiatric and psychology community. But we'll get to all that. But for the few people that maybe don't know who you are, haven't heard about the book, sorry. If you could just tell us a little bit about you, who you are, what you do, and sort of prior to this project, and then we'll get to that.
yes, I'm a British journalist, and I wrote. It's interesting, because I've been thinking about this recently. I wanted this book that I've written about what causes depression and anxiety and what solves them. I wanted to write this 7 years ago, and I ended up starting to write it about 3.5 years ago. And I realized that 7 years ago I was too frightened to write this book, and it's a sign of how frightened I was that, although I know it sounds ridiculous, I thought it would be easier for me to write a book about the war on drugs that required me to go and spend time with hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels that was less frightening to me than challenging my story about my own depression. And I think I was very committed to a kind of quite simplistically what would be called a simplistically biomedical view of depression. I thought I was told by my doctor when I was a teenager that the reason I was depressed was because I had a low serotonin in my brain naturally, that I had a kind of chemical imbalance. Um, and I think the thing is, when you've got a story about your pain and your distress, even if that story isn't working very well for me, and that story wasn't working very well for me, what it does is it gives you a sense that you understand where you are, right? Um, to me, the analogy I keep thinking of, it's not a great one, but it's like if you think of your depression as like a wild animal roaming around, well, what a story does is it puts a leash on it. At least you feel like you know where it is, right? And I was very conscious, although I was aware that there were things that were wrong with how I had come to think about my own depression and the growing epidemic of depression in our culture. Like, if it's just an imbalance in people's brains, why is it growing so much, right? Why is it increasing? I was really frightened to look into that. So I wrote this book about the war on drugs called Chasing the Scream, which is about the war on drugs, about addiction. And then part of working on that book, part of what I learned is we'd had addiction, drug addiction in my family. And part of what I learned is that we've been thinking about addiction in the wrong way. There's actually, I had, and I think the wider culture has really misunderstood what addiction is, what causes it, and what solves it. And it was kind of doing that research was just slightly, it was very important to me because I had lots of people I loved who had addiction problems, but that wasn't my problem, right? That for me personally, although obviously it affected me hugely. And there's something about going on that journey and learning, oh, there's this different way of thinking about addiction, um, that leads to a very different set of solutions that do actually work. And we can talk about that if you want. Um, it gave me the kind of confidence to think, oh, maybe if you look a lot at depression, if you go on a long journey into this and the best science and the best experts and people with different perspectives, maybe you will find a better story. It wasn't just a matter of giving up the old story, it was about finding a better story. So I think that kind of gave me, that was the kind of background to what brought me to the moment where I was writing this book. Does that make sense? I've just said that in a very, I'm chronically undercaffeinated.
No, it does make sense. So but your history of depression goes back to your teenage years. Is that correct?
Before my teenage years, yeah, there were these two mysteries that led me to write the book, really. One was I'm 39 years old, and every year I've been alive, depression and anxiety have increased in Britain and across the Western world. And I wanted to understand why. And this is for a very personal reason. This is the other mystery, which is, I'd first asked for help with it when I was a teenager, but when I was a teenager, I'd gone to my doctor. I'd explained that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me and I couldn't control it or regulate it. And my doctor told me the story that we're talking about. He said, "Oh, don't worry. We know why people feel this way. It's a chemical called serotonin in people's brains that makes them feel good. You're clearly one of the people who's naturally lacking this chemical. So all we need to do is give you these drugs." So he gave me an antidepressant called Seroxat, which I started taking. Immediately felt significantly better. I did feel quite a lot better but within a couple of months, this feeling of pain started to kind of leak back through. So I went back. He said, "I haven't given you a high enough dose." He gave me a higher dose. Again, I felt better. Again, this feeling of pain came back a bit quicker that time. And I was in a cycle where I was eventually taking the maximum possible dose for 13 years with a couple of very short breaks. At the end of which I was still depressed and I was having all sorts of horrendous side effects like massive weight gain. Um, and so what I wanted to understand really was what was going on here, because there was a gap between the story I was told by my doctor, it's just a problem in the brain, and both that can be fully solved by these drugs, and my own experience, which was the drugs had given me some real benefit initially, but had not over time solved the problem. And also, more importantly, a gap between what my doctors told me and the reality I could see in the sociology and the best evidence of what was happening in the society, which was that depression, anxiety were massively rising. So I wanted to understand this. So I ended up going on this big journey for the book. I ended up, you know, traveling over 40,000 miles, meeting the best experts in the world who've studied what causes depression, anxiety, what solves them, but also just people with very different perspectives from, an Amish village in Indiana, because the Amish have very low levels of depression. Your beard is making me picture them. And to a city in Brazil where they banned advertising to see if that would make people feel better, to a lab in Baltimore where they were giving people psilocybin, the active component in magic mushrooms, to see if that would make them feel better. And, there's lots of things I learned, but to me, the core of it was, I realized that until I went to my doctor when I was a teenager, I thought my depression was all in my head, meaning I was just being weak. I needed to man up. That phrase existed then, but the sentiment definitely did. And then for the next 13 years, I thought my depression was all in my head, meaning it was just a chemical imbalance in my brain. But what I learned is there are real biological factors that can make you more vulnerable to depression, anxiety, that I write about. But I learned actually there's 9 causes of depression and anxiety for which there's scientific evidence. 2 of them are indeed biological, and it's to some degree in our heads physically. Um, but actually, most of them are factors in the way we live. They're not in our heads, they're in our lives, in our culture, in the way we're living. And that opens up a very different set of solutions alongside the ones that I was offered by my doctor.
Okay, so let's pick some of that apart a little bit. So I guess in retrospect, looking back, for when the onset of your depression during your teenage years and that time when you first went to the doctor, was there anything going on around you that you look back on now and think, oh well, of course that's why I was feeling that way? Or was it, because some people kind of feel depression in the sense that they feel it, but they don't know why, and they don't know what it is. Even if you ask them, they'd say, I don't know why I feel this way. So what was looking back, what was your situation at the time?
Can I answer the second bit of that first, if that's okay? So that I'll talk about myself, my own experience, but I think you've gone to a really important question as well, which is when you talk about the causes of depression and anxiety and the evidence for them, you get a lot of people who totally understandably say, I don't know the causes of my depression and anxiety. It didn't seem to have a cause. It just came to me. Just the experience of, I would say, a lot, if not most people who become depressed and anxious. And I was thinking a lot about this as I spoke to these experts who were explaining to me the scientific evidence. And I kept saying, but what about these people? And I really began to understand it when I read quite a lot of feminist books from the early 60s. There's something that keeps recurring in a lot of these feminist books, right? In the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, you get a lot of women who would go to their doctor and they'd say, doctor, there's something really physically wrong with me. They would have said their nerves at the time, not their brain, or people talked about in terms of nerves then. They said, doctor, there's something really wrong with me. I've got everything a woman could possibly want. I've got a husband who doesn't beat me. I've got a car. I've got 2 kids. I've got a washing machine. I've got a house. But I feel like shit. There must be something really wrong with me, my nerves. And very often the doctors would say, yeah, there is something wrong with you. And they would, give these women Valium or whatever. If we could go back in time and speak to those women now, I think what most of us would say to them is, well, you've got everything you could possibly need by the standards of the culture. But it turns out the standards of the culture are just wrong, right? You need much more than this. You need much more than just a washing machine and, 2 kids and a husband doesn't beat you. You need meaningful work, all sorts of things, that women didn't have access to then and are still, not given equal access to now. And in a similar way, one of the things I learned, I'm sure it's something that will emerge as we talk, is the standards of our culture about what it means to have, what our culture offers us as a way of having a good life is not enough, right? Krishnamurti, the great, for many people, Krishnamurti, the great Indian philosopher, said, it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society, right? And I think you can see this in the wider way. A lot of the developments in our culture, not all of them, there are lots of good developments in our culture as well, but everyone listening to this knows that they have natural physical needs, right? Obviously, you need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took them away from you, you would be screwed really quickly, right? But there's equally strong evidence that human beings have natural psychological needs, right? You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel that you have a future that makes sense. Our culture's good at lots of things. We've been getting less and less good at meeting these deep underlying psychological needs. And I think that's a big factor. It's certainly not the only one. That's a big factor in why we've got this growing crisis. So that's in terms of myself. I think you've gone to a really important question as well. And what's so striking to me as you ask it is, no one, no doctor ever asked me that in the 13 years that I was being given very powerful drugs. No one ever said, "Is there any reason you might feel this way?" Right? I had a few doctors over those years. Certainly, the first one only offered me the serotonin story. I don't think the others. I don't. They even offered a story. It was just, "Do you want to carry on? Yeah, okay." And I'm not particularly critical of those doctors. As a society, we've only given one lever to these doctors to pull, or a couple of levers they can pull now, not then. They could pull a bit of CBT or whatever, which has some value. So if we've only given them a couple of levers and they're confronted with genuinely distressed people, I don't think we can be shocked that they're pulling those levers. But the answer to that was, and it may be one of the reasons why I'm giving a very convoluted, long answer to a question, because it's a harder thing to talk about. For me personally, there are many things playing out, but quite a few of the factors I wrote about in Lost Connections were playing out. But the one that was most prominently playing out was the um, evidence about childhood trauma. When I was a kid, my mother had been very ill. My dad was in a different country. I experienced some very extreme acts from an adult in my life, and one of the things I learned about for the book was, and I found this very challenging, was the evidence about how, from a wonderful man, initially gathered by a wonderful man called Dr. Vincent Felitti, and I can tell you the story of the incredible breakthrough he made if you want, because I think it's a very revealing and important story. Um, but he showed for every category of childhood trauma you experience, things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, you're 2 to 4 times more likely to become depressed. If you have 6 categories of childhood trauma, you're 3,100% more likely to become to attempt suicide as an adult. And he also discovered an incredible breakthrough about what we can do about that, which is actually really hopeful. I hope we can get to talk about that as well. But so for me personally, it's not the only thing that was going on, but I think I'd grown up in an environment, that had a lot of insecurity and violence and things that should not have happened. So yeah.
I've got to say, you see, I don't have the childhood trauma, great childhood, but there was events preceding my breakdown, which again, in retrospect, were blatantly obvious. It was only this education, this consideration away from this idea of chemical imbalances that made me look at these situations and think, oh, fucking hell, of course it was that. Why? But the thing is, Johann, I don't know why I didn't realize that. I like to think of myself as fairly intelligent, and I know what's going on around me, but I didn't put two and two together. You didn't put two and two together. Why do you think that is, that we don't do that, even though, like I say, in retrospect, oftentimes it's so obvious what the cause of it might be.
Oh, I don't think you should feel bad about that, because this is the norm for human behavior. There's a huge amount of scientific evidence that humans don't understand most of the reasons why we do most things. Um, if you're interested in that, there's a book I really recommend reading by an incredible professor I've interviewed. Is at Charlottesville in Virginia, called Tim Wilson. It's a book called Strangers to Ourselves, and it's about, he spent like 30 years specializing in this. You can do loads of experiments that show people just don't know why they do anything, basically. We create stories retrospectively about why we did things, but at the time we don't know, right? So I'll give you a really simple example. I'll probably get a detail slightly wrong because I've not written about this, but one of the experiments he did is you get people to keep what's called a mood diary, right? So you have to write down how you feel like 5 times a day or whatever, and you rate loads of things. And if you get people to do that long enough, and you've got enough other information, so you have to get them to, they have to write down lots of things, you can actually genuinely figure out what affects their mood. So you can figure out, oh, Bob gets upset when it's rainy and when he's had a row with his girlfriend, and Jim gets upset when he hasn't eaten for 6 hours. You can figure it all out, right? So you can genuinely figure out what affects people's mood. But what happens at the end is really interesting. You get a load of people, you get say, so it's you get your mood diary, and they say, what do you think affects your mood, right? Just you. And then they get a totally random person who has never met you, they give them your mood diary for 10 minutes and say, what do you think affects his mood? That totally random stranger who's never met you is as likely to get it right as you are.
Wow.
That's how little we know what drives and motivates us as human beings. And there's loads of experiments he's done that show. So I'll give you another example. Um, they send a young female researcher, hot young female researcher, out into the park. And she's got to, so this is the fake bit of it. She says, oh, I'm doing some research. Will you fill in this? Can I ask you a questionnaire? Right. The questionnaire is whatever. It's nothing, it doesn't matter. And at the end, she says, um, you seem really nice. This is my phone number. Give me a call sometime, and writes down their phone number, right? And sometimes they do this in two different places. Sometimes she walks up to people on a bench and they're just sitting on a bench. And other times, somewhere in the park, there was like a rickety bridge that you had to walk over. It would make your heartbeat go up because it was quite rickety. And she would stand at the end of that bridge and interview people as they'd walked over it. So as they approached her, their heartbeat was beating more. They were aroused, physically aroused, because you get physically aroused if you're in a slightly, even mildly dangerous situation. And what the experiment wanted to figure out was, would people misread their arousal at walking over the park at thinking she was hot, and would they be more likely to phone her? And if I remember, do you see what I mean? And
Mm.
the figure, if I remember rightly, was she got 70% more callbacks when she'd stood at the end of the bridge than when she walked up to people in the bench. Now, I'm sure if you said to any of those men, did you want to phone that woman because your heartbeat was elevated because you walked over a rickety bridge? They'd all say no. They all thought they genuinely were aroused when they saw her, right? So do you see how that's a really good example of how we don't know why we do things? We misread all the time our basic responses. So the fact that we don't do that with something as complex and painful as depression, where actually self-analysis is really hard, and analysis of your situation is really hard, shouldn't shock us, right? Humans are not good at that across the board. So I think firstly there's that thing going on, which is this is just part of a normal pattern where humans don't know anything about why we do it. Well, not, I mean, it's exaggeration, so we don't know anything, but we know very little about why we do things. um, and we very often misread why we do things. But also, how would I put it, we've been subjected to a carefully constructed story has been promoted to us by advertising campaigns that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, right? That have sold us a very specific story. It's not that that story is totally false. It's not totally false. There are some aspects of truth in that story, but it takes one aspect of the truth and implies that it's the whole picture, right? Which is the idea that your biology drives your depression, right? There are real biological factors. It's really important to stress that. They're very real. I write about them in the book. I'll go through them. But at the same time, what we've been, and to me, this is the most problematic aspect of what I was told by my doctor, what it sounds like you were told by the culture, and maybe by your doctor as well. If you tell people that their depression is just the result of their biology, whether it's, low serotonin or something else, what you're telling them is that their pain is meaningless. Doesn't mean anything, right? It's like a glitch in a computer program. And one of the most important things I learned is our pain does have meaning. It's a signal. It's a signal that something's going wrong. It's a signal we need to listen to. And if you just pathologize it as purely biological, what you're doing is you cut people off from hearing what the signal is trying to tell them. It's a bit like I spend a lot of my time in the US, and one thing that never fails to like throw me is all the time in the US, people will offer you indigestion tablets like Pepto-Bismol, right? So they'll be eating and eating and eating, and they'll say, oh, do you want a Pepto-Bismol? And you're like, no, no, indigestion isn't a malfunction. Right? That's a signal from your body that you're eating too fast. You need to slow down, or you're going to injure yourself, right? Now, that's a trivial example because indigestion is infinitely less painful than depression and anxiety. But that tells you something really. These are signals, they are telling us something. If we don't hear what the signal is saying, we can't find the more meaningful solutions. And I'll just tell you, this is a long answer, but I'll just tell you one thing that really, there was a moment when this really sank in for me. I was learning this from lots of experts and lots of the evidence, but there was a moment when it really emotionally sank in for me. I went to interview this South African psychiatrist called Derek Summerfield, who's a really nice guy. And Derek happened to be in Cambodia in 2001 when chemical antidepressants were first introduced to Cambodians. And the local doctors, the Cambodians, didn't know what these drugs were. So they asked him, and he said, "Oh, he explained, and they said, "Oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants." And he said, "What do you mean?" He thought they were going to talk about some kind of like herbal remedy or something. Instead, they told him a story. And there was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields, and one day he stood on a landmine and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb and he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently, it's really painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb. Imagining it was quite traumatic for obvious reasons. Guy starts crying all day, doesn't want to get out of bed, classic depression, right? So the doctor said, so we gave him an antidepressant. And Derek said, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense. It wasn't some irrational malfunction. It was a response to things that were happening. They figured if they bought him a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position. Um, so they went and bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. They said to Derek, so that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? And if you've been raised to think about depression the way we have, that sounds like a joke, right? I went to my doctor for an antidepressant, he gave me a cow, right? But what most Cambodian doctors knew intuitively is what, the leading medical body in the world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not crazy, you're not a machine with broken parts, you're a human being with unmet needs. And what you need is love, support, and help to get those deeper needs met. That's a very different way of thinking about what depression is and about what an antidepressant is. I think it's really important. And you can see, think about that guy. If you said to that guy, imagine that farmer in Cambodia, the rice farmer, imagine saying to him, you've just got a chemical malfunction in your brain and you just need to drug yourself for the rest of your life, right? You can see how that would have cut this man off. So when you ask about your own, what I didn't see and what you didn't see, what we've been told is a kind of hijacker story, right? It, and I want to stress again, there are real biological factors. There's no truth in this story. What we've been told is a story that explains our pain and distress, um, that cuts us off from understanding those things, from these deeper causes, this deeper meaning. Doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the biological causes. Doesn't mean we shouldn't, that drugs should never be used. There are times when it's appropriate to use them, but we need to have a more sophisticated understanding. Not that this simplistic understanding has really damaged us, I think.
Yeah, I've got to say, I think, see, this idea that depression needs to be considered in a more complex way, that it's not just a chemical imbalance. That's not a new idea. That's an idea that's been around for a long time. I think one of the reasons that your book has had the impact that it's had is all the accounts of it that I've read, that people making that claim. I think yours is probably the most accessible and cohesive account that I've ever read of it, which is, I think, one of the reasons why it's caught so much attention. But there are going to be people listening to this who saying, "Yeah, I get what you're saying," and some people get depression because of life circumstances or whatever. But I've got a chemical imbalance. I know this to be the case for me. For me, this is a medical thing, and I take antidepressants for it, and they make me feel better. They've been a lifesaver for me. Could you just sort of, it takes up quite a significant amount of the first part of the book, but could you just sort of give us a succinct way for people to maybe reconsider that perspective? Like, what is wrong with this idea of the chemical imbalance?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's important to separate out two things: the chemical imbalance theory from whether chemical antidepressants have any value, right? Chemical
Yeah.
antidepressants do have some value. I think the value has been overstated by some people, but there's some real value there, and I'll talk about what it is. In terms of the chemical imbalance theory, and particularly the serotonin story, so it was very shocking to me to go and interview the leading experts on this. Funny enough, I was just speaking yesterday to one of the leading German experts on depression, and he said the same thing. So Professor Andrew Scull, who's the leading expert at Princeton, has said on this, I think these are his exact words, it's deeply misleading and unscientific to say that depression is just caused by low serotonin. Dr. David Healy, who's one of the experts in Britain, a more controversial figure, but in this respect within the scientific mainstream, said, you and certainly has good historical evidence for this, said, you can't even say that the idea that depression is caused by low serotonin has been discredited because there was never a time when it was credited. There was never a time when half of the scientists in the field believed it. And I think part of what happens is, um, I think it's happened with me. When you're told this story that it's just about low serotonin, so lots of things get packed into that idea, right? So one of them is the idea it's not your fault, right? So what some people hear when you say um, it's not low serotonin, because what we've been told very often, what people have been told are two possible stories. Either you're weak, you need to man up, pull yourself together, or you've got a chemical imbalance in your brain. And if someone comes along and says, well, it's not, I mean, there's all these scientists say it's not chemical imbalance, what they often hear is, fuck, so you're saying it is my fault. I am weak. I need to man up. And it's important to say neither of those stories are true, right? That it's neither that you're just a weak individual, nor that it's just a chemical imbalance in your brain. Now, it's important to say, and I go through how from interviewing one of the best neuroscientists on this, Professor Mark Lewis, there are real changes in your brain when you become depressed that make it harder to get out, right? And I go through how that works. So it's not that I'm certainly not I'm agree. If people feel, well, my brain changed when I became depressed that made it harder to get out, they are in fact right. There is very strong scientific evidence for that. The question is whether it was simply a brain problem that made them depressed in the first place, right? And for that, there is really overwhelming evidence that there are huge other factors going on that are causing our epidemics of depression and anxiety. And that opens up a different set of solutions. In terms of the benefits, so I said that in a slightly convoluted way, because as I say, I'm trying to wean myself off coffee and I'm basically dying. But so I would say partly that when someone says, and the other thing about that is, when someone says, how do I put it? If you're told that story, particularly at a formative age, as most of us were, I was a teenager, what happens is, this is a slightly fancy and pretentious way of putting it, but you learn to code or interpret your experiences that way. So I remember thinking when I was depressed and I started to feel better, I thought, oh, my serotonin levels have risen, right? And then when I felt worse, I go, oh, my serotonin levels are falling. That was how I was taught to interpret my feelings, right? And so if it comes along as these scientists did with me, and they say that's not right, retrospectively reinterpreting your behavior and reinterpreting your most intimate and deep and often painful feelings is a really hard adjustment to make. So to retrospectively tell the story of my life and go, oh, actually, well, that time that I felt really down, was that because it triggered memories of these bad things that happened to me when I was a kid? That time when I felt down, was it because I was really lonely? To go through and reinterpret the way you felt is extremely challenging, um, and difficult, especially if people think that what you're saying is, and by the way, you're going to have to give up all these chemical antidepressants and not be given any other help. That's certainly not what anyone should be saying to anyone. So to go on to the question about chemical antidepressants, I think we need to have a more nuanced and complex conversation about chemical antidepressants than we've had up to now. So there's a few things I mean, there's lots of things to discuss about that, obviously, but just to the leading expert at Harvard Medical School did really interesting research that looked at the effects of chemical antidepressants over time. And what he found was, so depression is measured by something called the Hamilton scale. A lot of the time, there's many ways of measuring it. It's one of them. And I've always felt really sorry for whoever Hamilton was, that we only remember him by thinking about how fucking miserable we are. But anyway, and so the Hamilton scale goes, to people who don't know, goes from 1, where you would be dancing around in ecstasy, maybe on ecstasy, to 51, where you would be acutely suicidal, right? And to give you a sense of movement on the Hamilton scale, on average, if you improve your sleep patterns, you'll gain 6 points on the Hamilton scale. If your sleep patterns deteriorate, like when you have a baby, you'll go 6 points the other way. On average, over time, chemical antidepressants give you a 1.8 point boost on the Hamilton scale, right? It's important to say a few things about that. That is an average. Some people will get more. I initially got more. Over time, I got less. And it's important to say 1.8 points ain't nothing, right? For some people, that's a real, and some people will get a bit more. That's a real benefit for some people. And for some of them, a significant number that will outweigh the significant side effects that many people experience. But the other thing I think we can see from that is a kind of obvious truth, which is for most people, that's not going to solve the problem. It may give them a little bit of boost. It does give some people a boost. Some of them a significant boost. For some of them, that outweighs the side effects. I mean, I experienced very extreme side effects, massive weight gain. Like 70% of men who take the drugs, it affected my sexual functioning, which also makes you more depressed. But a lot of people, there's going to be real benefits there. But yeah, there was a big fuss, whatever it was, a couple of months ago now, when the Lancet published a good piece of research about chemical antidepressants in the first 8 weeks, which showed what we already knew, but it gave us more evidence that chemical antidepressants do have more of an effect than placebo in the first 8 weeks, significantly more effect than placebo, which very much fits with my own experience, and more importantly, with the massive amount of scientific evidence that we have about that. But that's the first 8 weeks. The vast majority of people listening to your show who are taking chemical antidepressants will be taking them a lot longer than 8 weeks. For that, you have to look at the best piece of research we've got, which is called the STAR-D trial, which follows people over time who are taking chemical antidepressants. Really simple. You can't really rig that kind of research. And most of them become depressed again, right? Doesn't mean there's no value. Doesn't mean people taking chemical antidepressants should stop or any of those things. But it does mean we've got to radically expand the menu of options to deal with the deep underlying causes of depression and anxiety. So as you know, the last third of my book is where I went all over the world to find people who were doing that. And one of the things I learned is the more you understand the underlying causes, the more you can find meaningful solutions, which I want to stress again, should be offered alongside chemical antidepressants, not in place of them. Always the menu should include chemical antidepressants. There are some people in this debate, like I mentioned, David Healy, who I think literally thinks these drugs should be, are so dangerous that they should be, I don't want to put words in his mouth, I'm not sure, but my instinct is that, and people should double check this, but my instinct is that he thinks they really are so risky that that they should never have been brought to market. That's not my view, right? And my view is that they give some people some help, but are not solving the problem for most people, and we need to have a more honest conversation about it. I understand why that conversation is very challenging to some people. I was extremely resistant to hearing this. And you can look up all the articles I wrote over those 13 years in which I preached the benefits of chemical antidepressants. And so, yeah, I understand why that's extremely challenging, not least because if that's the only bit of the story I'm telling that you hear, the flaws in chemical antidepressants, and you don't hear, but there's all these other ways we can respond, and there's all this amazing evidence, all these incredible people doing this amazing work about other things we can do as well, then it just sounds like, oh, fuck. So you're saying, the one thing that's giving me a little bit of relief, if people think you're saying you want to take that away, which of course I don't, that would be a horrendous message, especially you don't hear all the other stuff. Sorry, I'm so undercaffeinated. I would rather have caffeine running into my veins on like an IV drip if I.
Right, Johann. I mean, we're already sort of running short on time here, so I'm trying to squeeze in a couple more questions if that's okay.
Yeah, no, don't. I can do like another half an hour if that's works for you. I've just got to. Yeah, great.
Oh, if that'd be great. Yeah. Okay, so oh, it's thrown me now. I was sort of rushing, so if we've got half an hour, right? Okay. Okay, I guess then a good question that sort of arises out of that then, this idea of being sort of sold this idea of the chemical imbalance. So, like you were saying, there's no actual scientists that ever agreed that this was the case.
I want to be careful about that. There's no scientist who said that low serotonin.
Okay.
I mean, no. Also, do you want to be clear? It's not there were no scientists. There was never a time when half of the scientists in the field would have thought that low serotonin alone was the cause of depression. There are scientists who are much more in favor of the chemical imbalance theory than I am. So you just want to be careful about that. It's not that there's no scientists who believe that chemical imbalance has a significant role in depression. There are. Yeah.
one thing it sort of leads to though is this accusation of doctors being in the pockets of big pharma, and that it's these it's all just been a marketing thing. It's trying to just get people to take drugs and stuff like that, and it's a lot of people believe in that, and but at the same time it kind of smacks of a bit of like tinfoil hat conspiracy theory. So where do you stand on that? What's your opinion on that as of antidepressants just being big pharma trying to push an agenda, so to speak?
It's too simplistic. There's lots of things going on here. So when it comes to big pharma, look, it's no more a conspiracy theory to say that GlaxoSmithKline want you to buy antidepressants than it is to say KFC want you to buy fried chicken, right? I mean, if the head of GlaxoSmithKline didn't want you to buy these antidepressants, he would be immediately fired and replaced by someone who did, right? So obviously, a big corporation wants you to buy its products, and there's no doubt, nobody can dispute that these companies oversold these. I mean, it's been established in court. These companies oversold these drugs and hid negative effects, right? That should not be in any way controversial. To give you one example, Elliot Spitzer, when he was the Attorney General of New York, who I know slightly, um, he took a big case against the pharmaceutical companies for the mis-selling of chemical antidepressants to teenagers. And they had to make a massive payout in court because it was demonstrated they had knowingly missold these drugs. For example, that's one of many examples. So nobody should dispute that obviously these companies want people to take these drugs, and nobody can dispute, unless you dispute the findings of the American courts and the massive amount of evidence that was presented there, that these companies did what big companies do, right? They hid evidence. They, just like KFC isn't going to tell you that fried chicken makes you fat, right? They're not going to do that, right? In fact, should someone produce such a study, KFC will try to hide it from you. I can guarantee you, right? And that shouldn't be surprising. And it's not like saying, it's not like some kind of bonkers 9/11 trutherism or something. These are just obvious facts, right? And I think about it slightly differently though than just the idea that all that's happened here is big pharma have done that. I think lots of things have happened at the same time, of which big pharma is just one part. So I'll give you an example. One of the heroes of my book, Lost Connections, is this amazing man called Dr. Sam Everington, who is a doctor in East London, where I lived for a long time, poor part of East London, though sadly Sam was never my doctor. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of people coming to him with really bad depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not blanketly opposed to chemical antidepressants, but he could just see that it wasn't solving the problem for most of them. He could also see he'd been told when he was a medical student, just tell them they've got a chemical imbalance, even though he knew the science was much more sophisticated than that. And he just thought this wasn't right. So he decided to try this experiment. He had lots of people coming to him with depression. Lots of them he could see were acutely lonely. That's one of the 9 causes of depression and anxiety that I present the evidence for in Lost Connections. So Sam decided to try this experiment. One day, a woman called Lisa Cunningham came to see Sam. Lisa had been she'd been a nurse. She'd been shut away in her home for 7 years with absolutely crippling depression and anxiety. And Sam said to Lisa one day, "Okay, don't worry, I'll carry on giving these drugs if you want, but I'm also going to prescribe something else. I'm going to prescribe for you to take part in a group." There was an area behind the doctor's surgery that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like. In fact, and Sam said to Lisa, "What I want you to do is to come and turn up a couple of times a week. I'll come with you, and with a group of other depressed and anxious people, I want you to turn Dog Shit Park into something nice," right? First meeting they had, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But as the weeks and months and eventually years went on, a couple of things happened. So first was they had something to talk about, Lisa realized, but wasn't how shit they felt, right? Most of the time, what depressed and anxious people is either drugs or the opportunity to talk about their pain, both of which have some value. But here they decided they were going to learn gardening. They're going to teach themselves gardening, right? These were inner city EastEnders. They didn't know anything about gardening like me, and they fuck all about it. They started to put their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence. Exposure to the natural world is a very powerful antidepressant. The other thing that happened is they began to form a tribe. They started to get to know each other. And they did what human beings do when we form tribes. They started to solve each other's problems. One of the people in the group, this is an extreme example, was sleeping on the night bus. They were like, of course you're depressed if you're sleeping on the night bus. They started to, you know, the group started to pressure the local council, my former council, Tower Hamlets, to get this guy housed, right? They succeeded. It was the first time they'd done something for someone else in years. It made them feel great. And the way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom. There was a study in Norway of a very similar program that's part of a growing body of evidence that found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants. I think for an obvious reason, right? It was dealing with the reasons why they felt so bad in the first place. And the reason why I mention it in this context of the question about Big Pharma, you think about what's happening there, right? So the most reductive thing to say, which is true, but it's a small part of the story. Well, it's a small, not the whole story, is there's a $10 billion industry designed to tell Lisa that she's got a chemical imbalance in her brain and all she needs are chemical antidepressants. And there is a $0 billion industry to get her to go gardening with people and make a lovely garden and get to know people, right? With a lot of support and love and care from that centre, the Bromley by Bow Centre. You should have Sam Everington on your podcast, by the way. He's an amazing, just a wonderful, wonderful human being. The So partly what's going on there is big pharma, but there's much deeper things going on. And I felt that myself, if I reflect on myself, right? I think you might be a little bit younger than me. How old are you?
35.
Right, you're a little bit younger than me. I'm
Yeah.
39. So when I was, I think, two, so just before you were born, Margaret Thatcher famously said, there's no such thing as there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and their families, right? And as you can probably guess, I never liked Margaret Thatcher. But one thing I realize is how much I internalized that idea, right? That a big part of what I'm saying is there are really strong social causes of depression and anxiety. I was depressed for a long time. I was trained in the social sciences. It didn't occur to me there were these social and psychological causes of my depression. It didn't even cross my mind that these things were playing out in my life, right? And I do think that happened in the wider culture. One of the big breakthroughs I talk about in Lost Connections, this breakthrough in the understanding of what depression and anxiety is, the proof that it has social causes, that the way we live together can massively increase or reduce depression, um, was discovered in 1978, right, the year before Margaret Thatcher is elected. And it's like this moment when the debate could have gone in a very different way, right? When it could have been actually we're depressed because of the way we're living. But what you get instead, I'm not suggesting this is conscious on the part of Margaret Thatcher or anyone, it doesn't work that way. What instead you got was this move towards a much more individualistic society. So even though I've always pretty much thought of myself as a lefty, right? I wanted a solution that wasn't about we have to live differently. I want a solution that I could spend 10 seconds on, swallow first thing in the morning, and then just go back to living my, isolated materialistic life, right? But and I understand again why this is very challenging to people, because the truth is, and we have to be honest about this, a lot of people, um, if you when you point out that to deal with our depression and anxiety epidemic, there are things individuals can do as individuals, as isolated individuals, and I go through some of those things in the book. But we're going to have to. The thing we most need to do is band together and change the way we live. There are a lot of people who totally understand and say, I can't look. One of my closest relatives is a struggling single mum who, works every hour she possibly can to keep her kids in their flat and, pay the rent, right? He's saying to her, the idea that, well, to deal with your depression, you have to democratize your workplace and fight for a universal basic income. I mean, you may as well talk to her in Swahili for that she could. It would be cruel to do that. She can't do that, right? Which is why a big part of my argument is we need to change the society and the way we live, precisely to give people like my relative a greater margin so they can change their life. And I go through in the book places that have done that. So I do think I understand why these messages are very, very challenging, but we just have to think through the truth and its implications, even though the truth and its implications are difficult. Because if we carry on with a culture where people are ever lonelier, where they're taught that life is about buying stuff and screaming at each other through screens, we're going to carry on having a growing depression and anxiety epidemic. And if on top of that we say to people it's just a problem in your brain, then we cut ourselves off collectively from understanding why we're in such pain and dealing with it. There's this evidence, just as a last thought on that, there's this evidence, it's a wonderful book by the psychoanalyst Stephen Gross called The Examined Life, where he talks about, apparently with leprosy, what like people with leprosy, their fingers fall off and things. Uh, we often People think that leprosy makes your fingers fall off. That's not true. What happens is leprosy makes you lose sensation, and that means you don't realize when your fingers are being damaged. If your fingers, for example, are being damaged. So if you've got leprosy and you put your hand on a really hot stove, you don't pull it away because you can't feel that it's burning your fingers, and that's why your finger falls off over time, right? You can't feel your pain, you can't feel your injuries. That's the really dangerous thing about leprosy. And in a way, I don't want to take this analogy too far, but if you are cut off from understanding your pain, then you can't react in the way that you need to. And as a culture, we can't react as we need to. And if you say, oh, the pain just needs to be either pathologized and seen as a sign of madness or drugged into submission, that means that we miss the signal.
Okay, so in the book, you identify it was nine causes of depression and anxiety. Not got time to go through them all, and even if we did, not going to, because people need to buy the book. Can't get everything for free. What I'm interested in, Johann, is you see there was ones for me that really connected. I was like, oh shit, yeah, that was me. Like a disconnection from meaningful work. That was definitely one for me, and loss of meaningful values, disconnection from a secure future. Firstly, I'm interested in how you wrote down these nine things, and then if you could sort of elaborate on what were your things. I mean, did you discover this whilst doing the research for the book, and then figure out your past from there, or did the figuring out your past come first, and then you sort of derived answers from that? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I tried not to see it all kind of through the prism of my own experience because I'm one person and my experience is unusual in some ways. In some ways, I had some unusual bad luck with some of the childhood trauma. In other ways, I had amazing good luck. I've always had work that I loved and found meaningful. So, and a lot of these factors didn't play out for me. I think what I did was identified who the leading experts in the world were. I went and sat with them. I spoke to them, and there's obviously huge numbers of people I interviewed who didn't make it into the book. And at the end of it, I said, who else should I talk to? And I interviewed all the people they said I should talk to. And so it was like a kind of little web spreading out from, so I started with a list of like 30 people and then followed the trails out from there. And I wanted to go with the causes of depression and anxiety for which I could find the best evidence. So there were some causes for which there's some kind of early evidence that I didn't include because the evidence isn't that clear, or so for example, there's some emerging evidence that depression seems to correlate with some kinds of inflammation, which would fit with what we already know about the fact there are physical causes, biological causes, there are your genes, there are real brain changes. Inflammation may be one alongside that, and those things will interact. So it's not just like not just a one-way thing where the genes cause the depression. It's that the genes interact with the environment and make you a little bit more vulnerable to these things. Maybe inflammation is like, but the evidence is just a particular point at which I wrote the book. The evidence was just too early to say. So quite a lot of things like that where I looked into it, thought, oh, should this be a chapter? And I just thought, well, I just can't. There isn't enough proof for this. So I tried to stick with the ones where there was strong proof and good evidence. But I included everything for which I could find, all the causes for which I could find good evidence. And in terms of myself, well, there were ones that I found, the ones that I found hardest to write about were the ones that I could feel had played out in my own life. So I'll give you an example. Everyone knows junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? and I don't say this with any sense of superiority. I lived on KFC for many years. There's a story about on Christmas Eve 2009. I went to my local KFC. It's the one at the end of Brick Lane, and I remember going in and I said my order, which is so disgusting I won't even repeat it. And the guy behind the counter said, "Oh, Johan, we're really glad you're here. Wait a minute." I was like, "All right." And he went back and he came back with all the members of staff and a fucking massive Christmas card to our best customer. And they were like, and they'd all written little personal messages. And I was like, oh, fucking hell. And then I realized that wasn't even the fried chicken shop I went into the most. And I was like, "Oh." And when the KFC shortage happened, was it about 6 weeks ago?
Yeah.
I don't eat at KFC anymore, but some friends of mine who I hadn't seen in years texted me going like, "Are you okay, Johan? I've been really worried about you." So we all know that junk food has taken over our diets and made us mentally sick. But what's interesting is there's equally strong evidence that kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick. I learned a lot of this from an amazing man called Professor Tim Kasser, who you should also interview. He's an incredible man. So he has shown the more you think life is about money and status and how you look to other people, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious. And he's shown some of the reasons why. And I found that very difficult because I realized, and I think I found this challenging, particularly because it was so contrary to my own self-image. I just realized how much of my life um, had been driven by these junk values. It was never 100%. I was never Donald Trump or anything, but how often, particularly when I felt myself beginning to feel down, how much the way I would try to lift myself up would be by bigging myself up, by showing off, by doing something kind of clever in inverted commas or whatever. And I realize now it reminds me of those old, I think it's a Buster Keaton clip of where he's sinking in quicksand and to get himself out, he reaches in to try to pull out his own legs, and of course it pulls him in even deeper. And I began to think it was a bit like that, so yeah, there were definitely causes I learned about where I had a kind of oh fuck feeling, like, oh, this is what I did. But then there were ones that had no relationship to my life. Like, as I say, when it comes to work, I've always been unbelievably lucky. I've always had work that I found incredibly meaningful, and I've always loved my work. Whatever, I've been very, very incredibly privileged in that way. More than any member of my family or anything like that. So yeah, I'd say it was a mixture.
I've got to say, Johan, I mean, that's a really good example that I'm glad. Well, I'm not glad that's what happened to you, but I'm glad that it's come up, because it is a complicated one. Is what follows from it. This idea of junk values and where we get those values from, and just the pressure of peer pressure and societal pressure and economic pressure. The question that arises from that is, once you had that realization about yourself, and to say that the answer is to reevaluate those values or step outside of them, it's fine to say that, but how the fuck do you do it, and what did you do to wrestle your way out of that?
So there's several things. So I go through in the book how this really interesting experiment that was done is to alter your environment as best you can. So for example, for 7 years I've not looked at my Twitter @mentions, mentions, and I rarely look at Twitter. I mean, I broadcast via Twitter to tell people things, but I try to limit my exposure. Twitter is an extreme example of a medium that tries to get you to think entirely in external and extrinsic ways, right? So, the other day I went to a music concert, right? And people will have seen this with any fucking concert you ever go to now. About a third of the people are just sitting there filming the whole thing on their phones, right? They're not experiencing it. They're. And why is that happening? It's not because they want to watch their clip of Beyonce or whoever it is 3 months from now. They're not going to look at that. You want to watch Beyonce's fucking great clips of her on YouTube, right? What they want to do is they want to display to other people, I'm at the Beyonce concert and you're not, you cunt, right?
Yeah.
And but what happens is, if you are, that's an example of how living your life according to junk values. You're not being present in the moment and experiencing this joyful thing of seeing this musician you love. You are actually emptying out that experience by trying to externally display it, right? And by externally displaying it, you're getting no joy from it, right? You're actually draining your joy from it. And that dynamic, that's an extreme example of a dynamic that's playing out for all of us. So there are all sorts of things you can do. So first thing is avoid your exposure to competitive and status-based environments as best you can. No one has to be on Twitter unless your job is working for Twitter. You don't have to be on Twitter. It's okay. You don't have to look at it. If you have to be on it for professional reasons, I've got something called Buffer app that lets you tweet without even seeing Twitter, right? Don't look at how many followers you have. Don't look at who's talking to you and then compare yourself. Go, oh, has he got more followers than me? Have I got more followers than her? Just don't look at it. So you can, there's a degree to which you can extricate yourself from competitive rights, a degree to which you can just name these things when you see them, right? And you can name your desires. Why do you, so I talk in the book about this wonderful guy I interviewed called Nathan Dungan, who did this interesting experiment with Professor Tim Kasser, where they got, so Nathan had originally been called in by a school, a middle class school in Minneapolis, who had this real problem where loads of their kids were just demanding things like really expensive sneaker trainers and were really enraged if their parents couldn't buy it for them, right? So they called Nathan in, and initially they called Nathan in to be like, um, will you come and talk to these kids about budgeting because they don't understand budgeting? And Nathan comes in and talks about budgeting. He's like, this has got fucking nothing to do with explaining budgeting to them. They were like in a rage and an existential panic about having these Nike trainers, right? It's like you talking to them about budgeting was missing the point, right? So with Professor Kasser, he did this really interesting experiment where they got these kids and their parents to come to meetings, and it was there was, I forget how many there were, but they met every couple of weeks for I think 6 months. It's in the right number of dates in the month in the book, sorry. And it was really interesting. So the first thing they did was they got them to draw up a list of what are these things you've got to have, right? And so they put these Nike trainers or whatever it was. And they talk about, well, how will you feel? What will you get when you get these trainers? These kids are not going to be fucking basketball players, or maybe some of them are, but that's not what's going on, right? When I craved Nike trainers when I was 10, I can assure you I was no more likely to play basketball than I was to go to the moon, right? But what will you get when you get these trainers? It doesn't take long for people to go, well, I feel I belong. I feel I've got a sense of status. I feel people will look at me and notice me, right? You can see what's the underlying emotion that they feel they'll get satisfied through this product, which of course they will not get satisfied through this product, not for long, comes to the surface. And then they have meetings and they go, well, how else could you get these things? And they, as the months go on, they talk about, well, what do you actually think is important in life? They look at adverts, they show how these adverts are constructed to make you think you'll get those things. Um, And what was interesting is the experiment showed over time you could really reduce people's junk values. And this wasn't something revolutionary, right? It was just meeting a couple of times a week and just talking about these things. So one of the things I do is I have conversations about this. I think, right, and I've been thinking, obviously, I've been talking about this a lot over the last, what has it been now, 4 months since my book came out, because, you know, I have tried to structure my life so that I'm getting out of the game of comparing myself to other people, getting high on external signs of success, right? And then you have a book that comes out and it's like, oh fuck, you've got, people are constantly telling you either this went well, that went badly. You could be looking at, I could look at Amazon at any minute and see how well my book is selling. And I've really felt in that first month when the book came out, a really big increase in my depression and anxiety, because you're like, this is no way to live, right? This is an awful way to be constantly thinking, how is the world judging me? And by the way, that's true whether the world is judging you negatively or, in the case of the book, positively. Like the book is, for that first month, it was selling really well. And I just thought, you know what, I've just got to not look at this, right? I've got to not see this, because whether it's good, it's good now. There will come a time when it's not good, right? There might be, if I'm really lucky, it might be a year from now it won't be selling well, or 3 years from now, whatever. But there will be a day when my books are not selling well, right? And if I let myself get, what's the thing everyone says in AA, what takes you up will take you down, right? There's a degree to which you can, and look, again, I'm in a privileged position where I'm more able to do this than a lot of people, but I'm in a really privileged position in all sorts of ways, but you can make a conscious decision to extricate yourself from environments where you'll be prompted to think in these comparison based junk values ways, You can initiate conversations with your friends, who, by the way, will be really fucking hungry to have these conversations, right? People long to talk about this stuff. You can start conversations with your friends so that you monitor it in them, they monitor it in you. You can see how these things play out. And more importantly, you can fill your life with things that you do think are meaningful. And again, I want to stress I was really lucky. Compare that to my relative I was talking about who doesn't have a margin for change. I was really lucky I did have a margin for change. And part of my argument is we need to change our society so everyone has a margin for change, and that I'm talking very specific way and realistic ways about how we can do that. But it's partly, there's all this evidence about dieting, that deprivation-based diets don't work. Just saying I'm not going to eat KFC anymore doesn't work. But saying I'm not going to eat KFC and I'm going to eat this nice, tasty stuff instead, that is much more effective. And in a similar way, part of the move away from junk values is to, and this is one of the things that Nathan Dungan showed in this experiment with the group that met, it's not enough just to say, well, that we don't want that. It's to say, well, we do want this. So I've tried to, instead of looking at Twitter, I always have a book I want to read with me. And you think I will always be more glad that I read a book than looked at Twitter, for example, right? I mean, that's a trivial example. There are bigger changes we can make, but we can, most people can change their environments in some ways that move them away from these extrinsic values, these junk values.
Okay, so sort of bringing this to a close now. Just a few more quick questions I'm interested in. The first one, I guess, is so once you'd identified these sort of lifestyle problems for you, um, how quick was your journey out of depression then? For like the first time, obviously you've spoken again. It's it may have recurred, but the journey out of it from being reliant on antidepressants to making lifestyle changes, how long was that journey out? And did you feel a palpable difference of the happiness or the relief from depression that came from antidepressants compared to having changed made changes, these lifestyle changes?
So I want to be really it's an important question, but I want to be really careful about how I answer it, because just to stress again, I'm not, and I know I'm not saying this, but you're not implying that I'm saying this, but my book is not about I did this and you, dear reader, can do it too, because I actually that's an insult to the fact that would be an insult to most people who did not have the freedom to maneuver that I had, right? Um, so a big part of my argument, so I'll just give you an example of what I'm talking about there, about why we need changes that make it better for everyone to be able to make these changes. So, for example, and I'll give a practical example, in the 1970s in Canada, they did this really interesting experiment. The Canadian government chose a town, genuinely, it seems at random. It's called Dauphin. It's in Manitoba. And they said to a huge number of people in this town, from now on, we're going to give you the equivalent of 15 grand in today's money, in British pounds, a year. Monthly installments, nothing you have to do for it. And there's nothing you can do that means we'll take this away from you. We want you to have a good life. It's called a universal basic income. I wanted to see what would happen. And it was followed very carefully, studied by this amazing woman called Dr. Evelyn Forget, who I got to interview. And loads of interesting things happened because people were given a margin to change their lives. It wasn't a huge margin, right? It's not 15 grand a year. You're not going to go and live in the Bahamas, but it freed people up to make changes. So what did they do? Virtually nobody stopped working altogether, but a lot of people turned down shit jobs and held out for better jobs. So it meant overall work standards improved. Um, People spent more time with their kids. A lot of people went back to school and studied again. But for our purposes, biggest change, huge fall in depression and anxiety and all forms of mental illness, right? Much bigger fall than there wasn't a fall in the surrounding areas, happened in this place. And that, I think that tells you something, right? If you give people a margin to change their lives, a lot of them will change their lives in really positive ways that deal with the causes of depression and anxiety. So for me, the other thing I would say, just as a kind of little caveat, so the first caveat is I'm not saying everyone can do what I did, because they can't at the moment, but we need to change our culture so they can make changes they want to make. Second is, one person's individual story isn't worth much. If anyone wants to listen to me, shouldn't be because of my individual story. It should be because of the amazing scientists who gathered all the evidence that I then present in the book. But in terms of the changes that I felt, I had already made some quite radical changes in my life. Um, So I used to have a very intense, high pressure job in the public eye, which I was very privileged to have. I'm not for a minute, you know, saying anything other than that I was really lucky and privileged to have that. And I went from that very high speed, manic job where you are constantly engaged in a kind of public rage, public approbation, all of that, to having a much quieter, slower job, which is to spend 3 years learning about a specific subject, researching it, going around places, stopping and thinking about it, and going back again, and not having any public exposure because you're just on your own and with the people you care about, talking and thinking about this subject. So that alone was just such a huge change that I know from the evidence would reduce anyone's depression and anxiety, right? Um, Also, there's all this evidence that if you've experienced childhood trauma, and I go through the amazing work that was done by Dr. Vincent Felitti on this, if you go through childhood trauma and you find ways to talk about it that show that you won't be judged and you shouldn't feel ashamed of it, that really reduces depression and anxiety. So I did that. I was able to, I think because I wasn't so raw from working in this manic way, I was able to reflect on and talk about some of these things that had happened to me when I was younger. Um, and this is part of a much bigger body of evidence that shame destroys people, right? Professor James Pennebaker at Florida State University, you should also interview, is really fascinating on this. One of the things we know is, for example, during the AIDS crisis, openly gay men um, died on average 2 years later than closeted gay men, even when they got healthcare at the same time, right? Shame is devastating for human beings. And when people can find safe places to release their shame, that has a very strong uh, positive effect on their mental and physical health. So I'd say there was the change in the way I worked and lived. There was the ability to talk about some of these traumatic things in ways that I saw I wouldn't be judged for it. There's a shift in my values over time. It's not to say my values were terrible before, but they moved more in a positive direction. And just yeah, I mean that's there. I mean there are lots of other changes as well, but I think so for me, apart from that initial chemical antidepressants, how do I put it? In the first, at first I did experience a real boost from them, but over time, quite rapidly, um, the boost was minimal. I'm not saying it was nothing because I think it's hard for me to judge. Um, and it was accompanied by, as I said before, horrendous side effects. So I don't feel now like I did when I was depressed and drugging myself at all. Right now, again, you don't want to generalize from one individual's experience, but no, that I used to say, I didn't put this in the book. I'm not quite sure I still believe it, but I used to talk about how the I used to call the state of taking antidepressants anti-depression, which is not the same as non-depression. I don't feel like I felt when I was anti-depressed. I feel non-depressed, which doesn't mean I don't have bad days. Doesn't mean I have days when I feel anxious or down, because there are such days. But I don't. I feel neither depressed nor anti. I feel significantly better than I did when I was taking antidepressants. Doesn't, again, with all the caveats, doesn't, not saying this will be true for everyone. Not saying they don't have value. Not saying everyone can do the things I've done. All of those things, but I do think, yeah, I feel radically better.
Yeah, I think you see, I only reservation in sort of, the plural of anecdote isn't evidence. But I think it's another reason why the book connected so well is you get your depression memoirs from people, and then you get your psychologists, psychiatrists writing their books with the 6 steps to get rid of depression or whatever. But I think it was this meeting of the science and personal memoir. That's what's been so powerful about it, and the fact that you've come through it based on the things that you've written about and the science that you've written about, I think that's what just makes it that much more of an impressive document, I think. And it's just like you say, even though you can't um, pass your experience out to everyone else, I do think it's important to hear that, well, I actually did this. It did actually work for me, regardless of all these, the privileges that you may feel helped you on your way. I do think there's a lot of value in just hearing you say, well, actually, this shit did work for me. Anyway, Johann, I really appreciate you joining me.
I think it's just one thing
Just
I'm saying about what you just said, which is I do think I think one of the worst things we do with depression and anxiety is we tell a story about people being broken. We tell a story of brokenness, right? And I don't think depressed and anxious people are broken. I think they are expressing totally understandable forms of pain. Doesn't mean it's not absolute agony. It's absolute agony, right? Being burned in a fire is agony. That makes sense too, right? Explaining that why fire burns people doesn't diminish the terrible pain that burns victims feel, right? In fact, it helps us to understand it, right? Um, I think we need to stop telling stories of brokenness. We need to stop because I don't think it's true. I think it pathologizes the pain when we should be understanding it. But also, see, there's a lot of evidence. I didn't write about this in the book because I just didn't want the book to be too long. But there's all this really interesting evidence about what's called post-traumatic growth, right? We all know the story. Anyone in Britain would know what the phrase post-traumatic stress means. Pretty much anyone, right? But there's equally strong evidence for something called post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth is when people go through traumas, some people will experience what we call post-traumatic stress, right? Um, Other people will experience what we call post-traumatic growth. Actually, a lot of people, for example, there's been studies looking at crashes. Some people after a plane crash are just terribly devastated and traumatized by it, right? No one likes it, obviously. But some people after plane crashes, although they always lament the fact that a plane crashed, it was a terrible thing, you know, quit their jobs, leave the husband who was treating them like shit, change their lives in all sorts of positive ways. And years later, although of course they're not glad a plane crashed, they're glad for what the experience gave them, right? And I think if you just tell people stories that are broke, if you go to people who've been in a plane crash, say, you're going to experience this terrible trauma, right? Yeah, I actually think that it can deepen an impact. Well, we know that creating expectations of something makes it more likely to happen. And I think what we need to say to depressed and anxious people is you are going through agony. You don't deserve this pain. You are not broken. You are not crazy. Um, this pain has meaning. It makes sense. And what you need is help and love to deal with the things that are causing this pain so that we can help you turn it around and that you are surrounded by people who feel the same way and have the same need as you and together we can change these things. And what you need is love and support and an environment of love and support to do that. That to me is a much more powerful message than one about broken, just saying these people are broken, they're diseased, and they need our kind of pity. And I go through the evidence in the book that actually that doesn't reduce stigma. There's a lot of evidence, experiments on this, that doesn't reduce stigma. What reduces stigma is talking about the meaning of the pain. And I think that's a really important shift that is a difficult one to make for all sorts of reasons that we've talked about, but is much more powerful and much more true.
Yeah, that's a brilliant note to end on, Johan. However, just very quickly, I've got to run some quick fire questions past you. Every guest gets subject to this, and first one I'm particularly interested in hearing your answer on, and that is if you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public? And I always say, think dictatorially. You can
Yeah.
do whatever you want.
I always think dictatorially, don't worry. I would, every GP surgery would do what they do in that place in East London, Bromley by Bow Centre. I did so what's called social prescribing. Um, every single GP in Britain would be able to prescribe for people to take part in groups that did things as groups in a community, like that gardening program. But there's loads of other different things you can do for people who aren't interested in gardening. Absolutely every single GP would have that power. By the way, it costs nothing. Bromley by Bow Centre is all run by volunteers, that stuff, right? It costs virtually nothing. So this is low budget. I actually I had a meeting with Jeremy Hunt, the health secretary, who obviously has different politics to me, and I said to him, and he, I talked a lot about social prescribing because I think that's the one thing where, you know, frankly, most dealing with most of the causes of depression and anxiety requires going against Tory policy for very good reasons. But in this instance, this totally fits with Tory philosophy, right? Which doesn't mean it's wrong. It's the rare instance where Tory philosophy is compatible with something that's also right and true. So absolutely, that's something you could really do.
Okay, three more quickly.
Okay.
What's the best piece of life advice anyone's ever given you?
I think it was probably my grandmother, who I love very much, who my mum's mum. Um, she said to me, my grandmother grew up in a extremely poor Scottish tenement, and um, never she left school when she was 14. She never really understood the kind of she always when my mum and my grandmother wanted to impersonate me, they would always go, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah," because they just think I'd be like hilariously posh. But my grandmother said to me many times when I was a kid, never let anyone think they're worth more than you, and never let anyone think they're worth less than you. That's a pretty good guide through life.
Okay, outside of family and career, what investment of time or money has brought you the most joy or fulfillment?
Oh fuck! Outside of,
Family and career, everyone falls back on them, so you're not allowed them.
I think this sounds like a bit of a banal answer, but I mean, this is sort of part of my career, but not really. It's just reading. Like, I basically read constantly, and it's by far the best antidepressant I've ever had. And there's a great line. One of my favorite writers, James Baldwin, said. He said something like, "You think your pain is unique, and then you read, and you realize that the things you thought made you unique are in fact the things that connect you to everyone else in the world." I
Mm,
think that's so true as a way of honing empathy and seeing the internal lives of other people. For me, it's reading, but for other people, it'd be, other things.
okay, and last, but by no means least, what do you think is the key to happiness?
There's this thing the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, which is "hell is other people," which I think is exactly the opposite of the truth. I think the key to happiness is other people and connect. I mean, it's a bit twee for me to say connection, but I do think the key to happiness are those moments when you feel that your story is flowing into someone else's story and their story is flowing into your story, and you are part of something bigger and more meaningful than just your ego and yourself. These moments of awe and transcendence, which can be really small things like, this morning I took my friend's son, who's about to turn 7, to the park. And we were trying to play with a drone that I bought him. It can be a moment of connection that's small like that, or a big moment of transcendent connection, like a music concert or a political protest, or you know, it can be many things. But these moments of connection is the moments when you are no longer just you. One of the most banal cliches we say in our culture is "be you, be yourself." Even like fucking shampoo bottles say "because you're worth it." One of the things I learned is that's almost the opposite of the truth. Don't be you. Actually, thinking about you is there's a lot of evidence makes you more depressed. Actually, don't be you, be us. Don't be yourself, be we, be the group. The moments when humans feel best. There's a study, just as the last thing. It's really impressed me. I went to interview this woman called Dr. Brett Ford in Berkeley, who did this really interesting research. She wanted to figure out, if you try consciously to make yourself happier, will you actually become happier, right? And they did this study in 4 places in the US, uh, Taiwan, Japan, and Russia. What they found was really interesting in the US, and I'm pretty sure for us, for reasons I'll explain, if you try to make yourself happier, you do not become happier. In the other countries, if you tried to make yourself happier, you did become happier. And they were like, what's going on? When they looked at it again, what they discovered is in the US, and I'm pretty sure for us, if you try to make yourself happier, generally you do something for yourself. You buy something, you show off on Instagram, you try to get a promotion, whatever it is. In the other countries, when you tried to make yourself happier, generally you did something for someone else. whether it's your family, your community, your group, right? And it turns out our idea of happiness just doesn't work. Individualistic visions of happiness don't work. We wouldn't have survived as a species on the savannas of Africa if we'd all been selfish individualists. We wouldn't be having this conversation because our ancestors would have died out in one generation, right? The Just like bees need a hive, humans need a tribe, humans need something bigger than themselves. So I would say happiness is the moments of connection with something bigger than yourself. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
But a great answer. Okay, Johan, have you got any links, social
Um,
media? I know you're not keen on social media, but any way you'd like to
I
direct
have,
the listeners, the viewers?
my publishers always tell me to say this little spiel that makes me sound like a right dick. But if you would like any more information about where to get the book or the audiobook, if you would like to know what a range of people have said about the book, from Russell Brand to Hillary Clinton to Davina McCall, if you would like to take a quiz to see how much you know about the causes of depression and anxiety, and if you would like to hear audio of any of the kind of experts or other people we've talked about, you can go to www.thelostconnections.com. It's thelostconnections.com because it turns out there's a fucking band called Lost Connections who own all the websites. I didn't know that until too late. Also, you can find out where to follow me, although I will not hear you back, on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And I had this weird experience recently where I did an interview, and at the end they were like, "What's your Twitter? What's your Facebook? What's your Instagram?" And then they said, "What's your Snapchat?" And I was like, I am a 39-year-old man, right? 39-year-olds on Snapchat are certainly paedophiles and should be immediately put in prison. So you cannot find me on Snapchat, but you can find me on all the other places where I will never hear what you say to me.
Okay, well, as usual, I will include all those links, excluding your Snapchat, in the show notes. And yeah, in the meantime, Johann Hari, thank you very much.
I really enjoyed it. Cheers.